much biology, don't know much about a science book, don't know much about the French I took.
How to succeed in college. In this video, I'd like to explore some of the main reasons why students struggle with succeeding academically in college. As in most of my other videos, I'm basing my insights on my own personal experience as a college professor of psychology, which I've been doing for the last 25 years or so. Throughout that time, I've seen many students succeed and many students fail, and I feel like I've gained some insight into some of the main reasons why. So throughout this video, I'll be focusing not so much on students who are succeeding in college, but on students who are having academic problems. Sometimes these students are struggling because too many external pressures are interfering with their academic performance. These kinds of factors include things like family problems, relationship problems, problems with their living arrangements, and general financial hardship. However, for many other students, their struggles are rooted more in what they're doing or not doing as students. In these latter cases, it seems to me that their struggles mostly boil down to two principal components: general attitudinal factors and practical skills. Let's look at attitudinal factors first. In my experience, apart from external problems, probably the single greatest reason why students end up failing in college is that they simply lack a fire-in-the-belly kind of motivation to succeed in the first place. Of course, another factor in academic success has to do with constitutional variables, such as students' levels of innate intellectual talent. However, over the years, I've become increasingly convinced that motivation and tenacity are the most important determinants of success in college, much more important than raw innate talent is. That's because, along the way, I've seen many extremely talented young people crash and burn academically, mostly because they just don't have a genuinely passionate engagement with the process of learning, or at least not with academic learning. Most commonly, students like that are just using their innate ability to skate by with a minimum of effort, not to aspire to genuine excellence in what they're doing. And often enough, that desire to get by with the bare minimum turns into a formula for outright disaster. It's a little like that old children's fable about the tortoise and the hare. I find that in the academic world, 9 times out of 10, the tortoise, the student with perhaps mediocre natural talent, but a lot of inner motivation and fire in the belly, will eventually end up succeeding where the lackadaisical but extremely talented student will not. So, in my mind, I've come up with a maxim to describe that very common reality. Unfulfilled geniuses are a dime a dozen. Of course, in our culture, we tend to idolize talent and genius, but that's not really what's important. What's important is the fulfillment of genius, not its mere existence in the form of aptitude or potential. After all, what does it matter how intelligent someone is if that intelligence never comes to fruition by affecting positive change in our world somehow? However, at a deeper level of analysis, I find that the most common reason why students lack motivation is that they're not really in love with learning and intellectual activity more generally. For these students, academic learning is mostly an obligatory task thrust upon them by society's economic and vocational exigencies. In other words, they're there mostly to get job credentials, to get their tickets punched, rather than because of a genuine love of learning and thinking. And at one level, this is perfectly understandable. After all, pretty much everyone wants a good job. Pretty much everyone wants to be able to meet life's pragmatic demands effectively and easily, and getting a college degree can be a possible path, but definitely not the only path toward doing that. However, a problem emerges when things are out of balance in that direction, and students' chance to experience an intrinsic love of learning is compromised in the process. The problem is that placing too much emphasis on obeying external forces and dictates tends to produce only a very tepid level of motivation. That's because when we're doing things because we're just obeying external commands, it's rarely as inspiring as when we're genuinely in love with what we're doing. True, students who are there mainly to get job credentials will usually jump through the hoops when necessary, but they'll also often delete most of their memory buffers at the end of each semester. And consequently, at the end of their college careers, it's often hard for them to speak convincingly about what they've really learned over the previous 4+ years. And often enough, they don't even make it that far because their lackluster motivation produces an outright catastrophe long before they've completed their degrees. However, I would also say that this kind of imbalance toward externalized sources of motivation doesn't really originate in college. That exact same kind of imbalance recurs throughout much of their academic experience, all the way from kindergarten to high school, where the main emphasis is often on simply exacting obedience and only rarely on fostering a genuine, abiding love of learning. So, when they get to the undergraduate college level, they're often still operating mostly according to that same obedience/obligation paradigm, rather than a passion-driven template where intense motivation would come more naturally. Motivation becomes a problem for many students mostly because they've been taught to obey rather than to love. And so, their engagement with the tasks of college is often begrudging rather than wholeheartedly enthusiastic. It's because they've hardly ever been told that it's important to be not only an intelligent, well-educated person, but a passionately intelligent, well-educated person. So, if I had to offer a word or two of advice to students who are struggling with motivation, it would probably be this. Against all odds and against everything you've probably been told, see if you can let yourself fall in love, madly and rhapsodically in love with the process of learning, for its own reasons and for its own inherent beauty, rather than merely as a stepping stone towards something else. See if you can let each of the things you're learning today become a gateway to experiencing the greater charm of the universe. See if you can let each of your classes and each of your assignments become an implicit invitation to join the mad kaleidoscopic dervish dance of life itself. Because only then will your learning and this unique, unduplicatable part of your life gain their proper force and their proper direction within the larger arc of your existence. Because the point of becoming well-educated is really to become a more passionate and more aware human being, even if you've never been told before that this is true. However, as I said earlier, general attitudinal factors like motivation constitute only one part of the formula for success in college. The other part has to do with more specific skills, such as how to study and learn effectively, which in turn usually translates pretty quickly into doing well on tests and assignments. Over time, I've noticed that students often struggle with two important general prerequisites to acquiring good study skills. First, students fairly frequently struggle with absorbing the meaning of that time-worn adage, half of life is just showing up. Sometimes this takes the form of chronic physical absence from class for whatever reason. However, more commonly, it takes the form of mental absence. After all, it doesn't really matter if you're physically present in class if your mind is light years away. For instance, if you find yourself frequently fiddling with your cell phone or chatting with friends in class, it probably means that you're not really mentally present to what you're actually there to learn. And in reality, why even bother going to class in the first place if you're going to be mentally absent? You might as well be out earning money at a job, or even just staying home enjoying yourself. Yeah, I realize that it's almost always more immediately pleasurable to focus on Facebook or Twitter while you're in class. But the question is doing that really serving your larger interests in life? Or is it mostly about letting your smaller, more or less addicted, pleasure-seeking self compromise your deeper goals and desires? In my experience, it's usually the latter. So my advice in this area would be, try to let what serves your deeper purpose win out over the temptation to be absent either physically or mentally. Try to absorb the idea that if you just show up both physically and mentally, half your work for the class is probably already done. Of course, this means that the other half still remains. But if you've shown up all along, you'll already have a lot of money in the bank, so to speak, at test time. And if you struggle with maintaining quality attention during class, try sitting in the front row. For a lot of us, doing that makes it much easier to focus our attention on what's going on, which is what you're really there for in the first place, isn't it? Yes, I realize that many of us professors like to drone on monotonically, especially about things that don't seem particularly relevant to your life. But don't let our pedagogical faults and foibles limit your potential to learn. We don't define you or your experience. Only you can do that. The second general prerequisite to good studying skills involves procrastination, which is a habit that plagues many students. If you want to hear my fuller analysis of procrastination, you can see the video I made specifically about that. However, at this point, let me say that although we all have many convincing excuses for procrastinating, it hardly ever serves our greater interest to do so. That's because people hardly ever perform better in a frantic 11th hour panic than they do by training strategically and methodically over time. So I would say that if you really want to fulfill your potential as a student, if you really want to aspire to excellence in what you're doing, you're probably going to have to give up the nasty habit of procrastinating all the time. Sure, it affords you short-term pleasure, but only at the expense of your larger and deeper destiny. It isn't helping you, and it isn't your friend. In reality, it's actually your enemy and is only pretending to be your friend. And this brings us to study skills themselves. In this area, I would say generally that what works for some students doesn't necessarily work for others. Some students study better on their own. Others do better when they study with partners. Some students like to work with flashcards and others don't, etc. So what's important in college is to locate and actively practice the method that works best for you personally. However, I have found that there is one common factor among students who are struggling, especially with doing well on tests. Students who struggle with tests almost always haven't mastered one crucial meta skill. They don't know when they really know something and when they don't. For instance, when students come to my office after doing poorly on tests, they'll often tell me that they studied long and hard, but for some reason, they were thrown by the test itself. But when I start asking them about the particulars of the material on the last test, it almost always turns out that despite their hours of studying, they can't actually tell me too much about the content of the material they supposedly mastered. In other words, their so-called studying is generating the illusion that they know things, when in reality, they usually don't. Most commonly, this takes the form of reading through class notes over and over, which eventually produces the sensation that there's nothing particularly disturbing or disconcerting about what they're reading. However, what these students usually don't realize is that it's one thing to be able to read through class notes without being disturbed or confused by them, but it's something altogether different to know them so well that you can explain them convincingly from beginning to end without any prompting whatsoever. It's that second level of knowing that struggling students are usually missing. I also perceive that this is at the root of a lot of students' test anxiety. In other words, many students experience test anxiety basically because they're not used to knowing things so thoroughly that confidence is realistically warranted. It's because they've made a long-standing habit of knowing things only in a superficial way, and so they've built up a long history of taking tests without any real basis for confidence. And then, over years of repeating this experience over and over, they've come to associate any kind of test taking with the sensation of non-confidence and anxiety. In their experience, it feels like they just have some kind of constitutional test anxiety, when in reality, they've learned to be anxious about tests by repeatedly under-preparing themselves for them over the years. So, the corrective to this is to break that circular pattern by adopting a completely new paradigm of preparation and then gradually relearning over time that there's nothing inherently anxiety-provoking about tests when you thoroughly know what you're doing. But of course, then the question becomes, well, how does one do that? How does one break the habit of preparing only superficially for tests? course, the first answer has to do with procrastination, which we've already mentioned. It takes time to prepare well. But once that's solved, then what? With regard to tests whose content is more memory-driven, I find that the best strategy is to have some mechanism for encouraging the student to recite his or her learning aloud without looking at notes or cues. A study partner can help with this. If someone is asking you to explain X in real time and looking at you directly in the eye, it makes it much harder to get into the habit of using your notes as a crutch, which in turn can help pull you into knowing the material more thoroughly. Of course, it's important to pick a partner who actually challenges you and who doesn't let you rest comfortably in your already existing habits, but who pulls you higher than you'd otherwise go. The possible pitfall of working with a partner is that if you pick the wrong person, he or she will either drag you down or leave you exactly where you are. So my advice would be to be very judicious about whom you pick. But of course, not everyone likes to study with a partner. For these students, I find that working properly with note cards can produce some of the same demand effect during studying. The trick is to make yourself say out loud what the card is asking you before you turn it over. Also, remember to work the cards in the opposite direction too. However, whether the test is more memory-driven or more skills-driven, repetition is the key. As with so many other things in life, success is mostly about practice, 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 and then more practice. And this is where motivation comes in. Practicing something for many hours doesn't come easily to most people, mostly because it doesn't usually produce an immediately pleasurable feel-good sensation. It requires a real burning desire for excellence to carry us through the long hours of training that are necessary for excellence most of the time. That's true not only in the academic world, but in life generally. So my advice in this area would be, don't expect succeeding in college to be necessarily a feel-good process. Expect it to be difficult and demanding, but ultimately fulfilling. Remember that real excellence in life is mostly an acquired taste. So your experience of fulfillment in college will probably take time, perhaps many months or even years of sustained effort. And so, let me conclude this video by offering a couple of very general observations that will hopefully be helpful to you young people in college. First, remember that the overarching lessons you're learning in college are mostly about how to deal with adult freedom and adult responsibility. And in the adult world, you're free to succeed, but you're also free to fail. It's really mostly about you and your choices, especially in relation to your innate talents. And the fact of the matter is that you'll have plenty of opportunity to experience both success and failure along the way. Some days you're going to win, and some days you're going to lose. That's pretty much inevitable in this world. So, at the end of the day, there's really no tragedy in failing, in school or in life generally, because it's part of what we're all here to experience. Sure, it always feels better to win than to lose. But losing offers us a gift that winning usually doesn't. That's because our successes mostly just confirm what we're already thinking. Success is life's way of saying, yeah, okay, keep going. But failure really throws us back upon ourselves, makes us question what we're doing, and then asks us to change somehow. In one way or another, failure is life's wake-up call, its way of inviting us to alter our direction, or perhaps ourselves. And often enough, failure is really nothing more than life's way of asking us to walk some other road, one that, at least in my own experience, is almost always deeper and better than the one we're currently traveling.
Don't know much about geography. Don't know much trigonometry. Don't know much about algebra. Don't know what a slide